Hello, everyone. My name is Annabelle Gamberjouan, and I'm the Lillian and James Clark Assistant Curator of European Art at the Dallas Museum of Art. I'm truly delighted to welcome you all to this lunchtime lecture. The research that you'll hear today stems from an exciting new partnership between the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas and the Dallas Museum of Art. Spearheaded by Dr. Michael Thomas, director of the Edith O'Donnell Institute, and Dr. Nicole Myers, the DMA's chief curatorial and research officer, this collaboration aims to advance art historical research with generous funding initially granted to the DMA by the late Rick Bertel. Along with Nicole Myers, who is unfortunately unable to join us today, I want to extend sincere thanks to Michael Thomas, Heather Bowling, and the entire EODIA team for being steadfast supporters of research at the DMA. Our institution's joint interest in the artistic traditions of the ancient Mediterranean world was central to the creation of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History Provenance Researcher position at the DMA. Our first researcher, Crystal Rosenthal, held this position from 2023 to 2024. And today's speaker, Violaine Barthélémy-Mouez, has served as the EODIA Provenance Researcher at the DMA since 2024. Prior to joining the museum, Violaine worked in curatorial departments at the Musée du Louvre and the Cabinet des Médailles at the French National Library. She also conducted research at the Galerie Chonel in Paris, one of Europe's leading galleries of ancient Roman sculpture. Violaine holds a BA and an MA from the École du Louvre in Paris, where she specialized in the reception and collection of ancient art in the 19th century. She also received specialized training in provenance research at the Université Paris-Nanterre. Violaine's talk today takes a closer look at the fascinating afterlives of two Roman sculptures in the DMA's collection. Please join me in warmly welcoming Violaine.
Thank you, and good afternoon. And thank you for joining me today. I am grateful to the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History at the University of Texas at Dallas for supporting the Provenance Research Program on the Ancient Mediterranean Collection at the Dallas Museum of Art. The partnership with UTD has facilitated in-depth investigations into the individual histories of objects from the DMA's collection. Researching the provenance of an artwork consists first and foremost in retrieving its ownership history. But often, when doing so, we also shed light on the whole context in which an acquisition is made, and it tells us about the evolution of taste, the mechanisms of the art market, and on the history of both private and institutional collecting. So today, I would like to share with you the story of two ancient Roman sculptures in the DMA collection that stand out particularly in that regard. Their afterlife tells a lot about antiquity collecting, especially in the 18th century. So without further preamble, let's turn to our first sculpture. So this marble sculpture bust from the DMA collection on the left, as you can see, it was also engraved and published in 1755 in a catalogue called Collection of Antique Sculptures, Greek and Roman, found in Rome in the ruins of the palaces of Nero and Marius. We can clearly recognize the DMA bust in this engraving. It captures the bust with a striking precision, even if the image is mirrored, a consequence of the engraving process. But we see clearly the thick twisted laurel wreath, the long moustache, the cloak held by its fibula, and falling in fringes. The figure appears under the title The Emperor Commodus, with additional notations informing us that this is a Roman work in Parian marble and that it measures 2 feet and 1 inch. The title page of the catalogue explains that the antiquities illustrated within it were found in the ruins of the palaces of Nero and Marius in Rome, and that in 1755 they could be seen in Paris in the workshop of Lambert Sigisbert Adam, un sculpteur ordinaire du roi, which means official king's sculptor, who at the time was Louis XV. In the preface of the catalogue, which is on the right of the screen, we learn more about the history of the antiquities engraved in this catalogue. The 68 ancient sculptures engraved were acquired in Rome by the Cardinal of Polignac during his time as ambassador there. The sculptures were brought to Paris and entrusted with the sculptor Lambert Sigisbert Adam for restoration. And after the cardinal's death, Adam became the owner of the sculptures, which he published in 1755 in the present volume. So Melchior de Polignac, the Cardinal de Polignac, he was an influential clergyman and a diplomat who was appointed ambassador to the Holy See by the King of France in 1724 at the age of 63. Polignac knew the city of Rome well from earliest days, and he was closely connected to the most important Roman noble families of the time. During the 8 years of his embassy, his passion for antiquity deepened, and he assembled one of the most important and renowned collections of antiquities of the 18th century that he gathered in the Palazzo Altemps, the palace he was renting in Rome. The formation of Polignac's antiquities collection took place at a pivotal moment in Rome, when many historical antiquities collections that had been assembled by Roman noble families since the Renaissance were being sold off to foreign kings and foreign collectors. To give a few examples, the Earl of Pembroke in England bought the Giustiniani collection in 1720. The King of Spain bought the Odescalchi collection in 1724, and in 1728, the King of Poland purchased pieces from the Chigi and the Albani collections. As a result of this new international interest, there was a true ebullition in the Roman art market, with old families wanting to sell their collections and new collectors purchasing them for huge sums of money and taking them all across Europe. It also meant that there was an increased rivalry and an increased appetite for the discovery of more sculptures in archaeological excavations. So we know that Polignac did buy sculptures from old Roman families to constitute his own, but he also was a true scholar, and as so he preferred to be directly involved with new discoveries. So he financed several excavations, often in competition with the other great patrons. One of the excavations that he financed was a columbarium, or funerary site, of the freedmen of Livia on the Via Appia. You can see here on the engraving the monument with workers digging and exploring to try to find more sculptures in it. In 1729, Polignac financed another excavation, the exploration of a villa on the Via Latina between Rome and Frascati, known as the Villa of Marius, and there a particularly important group of ancient sculptures came to light. And it is this excavation that Lambert Sigisbert Adam commemorated in the frontispiece to the 1755 publication. Designed and engraved by Adam himself, this title page depicts Kronos, the god of time, and a winged female figure unveiling an excavation scene at the Villa of Marius. In the foreground lie emblems of the arts and the tools of the sculptor, next to an unrestored Roman torso. And if we zoom in the excavation scene itself, we see workers digging among the ruins of the villa, unearthing sculptures and hoisting them up with ropes, all under the supervision of distinguished spectators on the right, very likely including the Cardinal of Polignac himself. So once these sculptures were excavated, Polignac needed to hire sculptors like Lambert-Sigisbert Adam to restore them so that they could be presented in his palazzo. Lambert-Sigisbert Adam was born in Nancy in Eastern France into a dynasty of sculptors. He won the Rome Prize for Sculpture in 1723, which allowed him to study at the Academy of France in Rome, that is depicted on the screen in this engraving by Piranesi. So he stayed in Rome for a full decade, and it was there that he met the Cardinal de Polignac, and a very fruitful collaboration resulted from this encounter. So Polignac happened to be good friend with the director of the French Academy, and through his many connections, he gave the Academy's young artists access to major Roman collections, where they were able to study antiquities and to draw them. And as I mentioned, Polignac needed skilled sculptors to restore the ancient sculptures he was acquiring. So Adam, who was eager to establish himself, received a steady flow of important commissions and became the main restorer employed by the cardinal. And here I want to note that restoration in the 18th century context was considered an essential component of collecting. Once the antiquarian had identified the subject of a fragmentary statue that was newly discovered, it was up to the restorer to complete it, to provide the missing limbs and all the attributes and iconographic details so that the sculpture could be more readily understood. And far from being criticized, such interventions were celebrated. So the restored work was often judged more pleasing and sometimes even superior to ancient fragments on their own. And the restoration process is actually illustrated in the pages of Adam's publication. If you look in the excavation scene on the title page, this heavy sculpted torso that is being lifted up out of the ground also reappears propped up on the edge of the page as though awaiting restoration in the sculptor's workshop. We can see that it is the same sculpture because they have the same posture, they are both missing the right arm, and they have the same type of drapery falling around their hips. And a few pages later, the sculpture has been restored and completed by Adam as the god Perseus. In addition to adding the arms and legs, Adam has also added a winged helmet at the figure's feet to help identify the god. And this sculpture is now in the Luxembourg Palace, so that's the French Senate, in Paris. So now let's return to the DMA's bust and try to understand how it came to be in the possession of Lambert-Sigisbert Adam. So when Polignac left Rome in the summer of 1732, he moved all of his collection from Rome to Paris. At this point, Polignac's collection included at least 300 ancient sculptures. We know that from a description of the collection at the time. And not all of these sculptures were restored. So Adam, who left Rome just 1 year after Polignac, back in Paris, he remained involved in the ongoing work on the antiquities of the cardinal, and all the fragments still awaiting restoration were sent to his workshop. Polignac passed away 10 years later in 1742. And then a contract was drawn up between Adam and the cardinal's heir, because Adam still had a lot of fragments in his possession, and all of these fragments were given to him as a payment for the work that was still awaiting payment. And it is all of these sculptures that were published once restored in the 1755 catalogue. The contract document, of which I displayed a transcription excerpt on the screen, is now in the French National Archives. It lists all these sculptures and fragments. It also reveals that most of these fragmentary pieces came from the collection of Cardinal Lercari. The document says that there is a total of 65 fragments, but they are not all precisely described. But among the descriptions, we can read 4 fragments of busts of different sizes without heads. And this could relate to the DMA sculpture. Because indeed, if we look closer at the bust, we can see that it is made of 2 different parts, which were connected by Adam together. So now let's get a closer look at the 2 different parts. And the head first. In terms of iconography, the head can be identified as Heracles, the semi-divine hero frequently represented in Roman art. The type is quite close to the famous Farnese Heracles type, but with its long mustache, it should be associated with the Albani Vatican type, named for a sculpture of Heracles holding his son Telephus, that was in the Albani collection and who is now in the Vatican Museum. You see the sculpture on the screen. Another sculpture of this type is known at the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, where it forms part of a double harem. So all of these sculptures were almost certainly modeled after lost Greek original bronze of the 4th century BCE, later reinterpreted in Roman marble. Therefore, the head of the DMA sculpture probably dates to the late 1st century CE, in the early imperial period. The shoulders, on the other hand, are dressed in a paludamentum, a military cloak worn by Roman commanders, which, under the empire, was often associated with portraits of emperors. It is fastened on the right shoulder by a circular brooch, or a fibula, and it drapes across the torso with fringes falling over the left shoulder. And this style, with the fringes, became fashionable in the 2nd century CE, especially under the Antonine dynasty. This helps us date this fragment to the mid-2nd century CE. So to sum up, we have 2 fragments, one head from the 1st century and one set of shoulders from the 2nd century. The fragments were most likely part of the Lercari collection, as we learned from the archive document, from whom they were purchased by Polignac in 1728 and shipped to Paris in 1733, where they remained in Adam's workshop until he assembled them and published the restored new sculpture as a bust of the Emperor Commodus in 1755. And it chose this title, Bust of the Emperor Commodus, because the paludamentum on the bust indicates an imperial portrait, and the Emperor Commodus was frequently pictured as Heracles. But this also shows Adam's knowledge of Roman sculpture. So now let's return to the 1755 catalogue. If Adam agreed to be paid in kind, that is with the fragments directly, it is because he was hoping to be able to make an important profit from his new creations. So for the next 13 years after the death of the cardinal, he worked on restoring the fragments. And the Recueil de Sculptures Antiques must above all be understood as a commercial enterprise. Adam hoped to sell the collection, preferably as a whole, and for that he needed to make it known across Europe. He financed the catalogue himself, and working with the dealer Joulin, he distributed it to potential buyers all around Europe. The commercial intent is unmistakable in the preface, where Adam praises the collection as rare and singular. He imagines how it might adorn a gallery, a library, or a grand salon. It describes how it could be displayed in the manner of in Italian princely palaces, and writes that it would produce an admirable effect. And one of the selling points touted by Adam is the provenance of the sculptures, which he describes as discoveries from the palaces of Nero and the villa of Marius, the very sites where Polignac had been involved in excavations. But as I explained earlier, most of the works Adam was trying to sell actually came from the Lercari collection, which Adam chose not to mention, because by presenting the provenance as tied to celebrated excavation sites, Adam enhanced both the prestige and the market value of the works. But despite Adam's considerable efforts, the project failed. He did not succeed in selling the collection, and when he died in 1759, an inventory of his possessions shows that all the sculptures, at the exception of one, were still with him. On July 5th, 1759, the sale of the sculpture's belonging was announced in a newspaper advertisement that you see on the screen, but it specifies that the sale of his antiquities, terracottas, plasters, drawings, prints, etc., will be announced at a later date. Unfortunately, the trail runs cold at this point because no record of the sale has survived. We can, however, be certain that Adam's collection was dispersed rather than sold as a single entity, because, as he had intended, because several works have been identified in museums across Europe and in the United States. And if we look at these objects, it might give us clue on the itinerary of the collection after Adam's death. So if we look at this triangular altar, which is now in the Cabinet of Medals and Antiques of the French National Library, this was given to the museum by the Comte de Caylus, a famous French antiquarian, who published his massive collection in 7 volumes. And in one of these, we can find the same altar that was published by Adam. And Caylus mentioned Adam in the commentary for the plates, and he says, he even published a catalog with plates and explanations in the hope of attracting buyers, but he died without having placed any of these works. I purchased from his estate the triangular altar that is presented as number 1. So this tells us that the collection was sold. Similarly, a relief depicting the so-called Indian triumph of Bacchus can be identified from Adam's catalog, now at the Getty Villa in Malibu. Even though we don't know where this relief has been during the 19th century, the late 18th and 19th century, it reappeared in England in the early 20th century in the collection at Wentworth Wood House in Yorkshire. Photographs published in Country Life magazine in 1906 show the relief installed in the entrance hall, partly hidden behind the sculpture. And I know we don't see clearly on the picture, but you have to believe me. And following the sale of the house contents in 1949, the relief was purchased by the dealers Spink & Son, who advertised it in Country Life, still in 1952. And the Getty Museum acquired it the following year in 1953. So this example is very interesting to illustrate the interest of English collectors for ancient Roman sculpture, a phenomenon that we will now study through another example from the DMA collection, which is this marble statue of Apollo. So this sculpture was described in 1873 by the German archaeologist Adolf Michaelis, who visited the house of Rugby Hall, a country house in Yorkshire. And in his catalogue of ancient marbles in Great Britain, Michaelis mentions the Apollo. He describes it very precisely. We can recognize the sculpture. And he says it was located on the upper story in what is called the anteroom, together with a number of Roman statuettes in marble that have been very much restored, standing on console tables. At the time of this description, Rugby Hall belonged to Colonel Moritz, but the antiquities collection had been formed earlier by his uncle, John Bacon Sauray Moritz, who brought back antiquities from his grand tour. So this is John Bacon Sauray Moritz. And like many of his contemporaries, Moritz undertook a grand tour, which was a custom traditional trip through Europe with Italy as a central destination, undertaken by upper-class young men as a coming-of-age ritual. Moritz went on the grand tour in 1794 to 1796, and his travels took him to Greece, to Constantinople, and to Italy. And we are very lucky because Moritz's letters to his mother and his sister during his travels are published. And they gave us a vivid glimpse into this tradition of travel and collecting. In one letter from March 26, 1795, he is in Greece and he writes, "We set out from Athens on the 19th, and passing by Eleusis, slept at Megara. There, we found a little statue, half buried in the ground, which we dug up. You will laugh at me when I tell you that it had no head and its arms were broken. However, it was a female figure, and the drapery and attitude pleased me so much that I took the trouble of packing it off on a mule for Corinth, and so to Zante. If I can get it well restored in Italy, it will figure in the Rugby collection. And its greatest charm, perhaps, will be that I found it myself." Elsewhere, writing from Rome, he notes that he had been antique shopping. He says, "I bought 2 most beautiful cameos this morning, which were part of a Roman collection now selling off." So this resonates with the broader pattern that we have already seen of Italian collections being sold off in the 18th century to European collectors and to the international art market. And although Moritz does not mention our Apollo specifically in these letters, they show his personal interest in antiquities and the ways in which grand tourists acquired them, whether directly from excavation sites or from collections being offered for sale in Rome. So where did this Apollo come from? And once again, we are fortunate because the sculpture appears in a drawing in a manuscript known as the Codex Montalto, that is dated around 1623 to 1631. The Codex contains nearly 280 drawings of antiquities belonging to the Montalto Peretti family that were then displayed in their villa in Rome. So this is the Montalto Peretti villa, which does not exist anymore today. It was destroyed in the 19th century and is where now stands the Termini train station for the one who know Rome. And Cardinal Alessandro Peretti Montalto was a nephew of Pope Sixtus V and assembled an immense collection of ancient sculptures for his villa, whether from excavations, from other Roman families, or from dealers and restorers. At his death in 1623, his collection included nearly 500 antiquities, listed on an inventory now preserved in the Archivio di Stato di Roma, and also drawn in the Codex Montalto. So the inventory records 2 statues of a naked Apollo seated with a harp, both of which are illustrated in the Codex. But based on the figure's posture, it appears that the Diema's Apollo is the one on the left. And the Codex shows Apollo with all his limbs and with the lyre, which was already broken by the late 19th century, as we saw from the description in Rugby Hall. After Alessandro Peretti's death, the collection remained in the family, but it did not continue to expand. We know that in 1655, the Apollo is still in the villa because it is mentioned in an inventory. But from the mid-17th century onward, pieces of the collection began to be sold. In the late 17th century, the heir of the family declared bankruptcy, and the villa was seized and auctioned to the Negroni family. Throughout the 18th century, the Negronis completely neglected the villa and gradually sold off antiquities. Some busts were purchased by the Cardinal de Polignac. And finally, in 1784, the Montalto Peretti villa was sold once more, and what remained of the antiquities was purchased by the British art dealer Thomas Jenkins. For Jenkins, this was a very important purchase, and he wrote in a letter, "I never had so much in my power at once to form collections as at present, and it is most probable such an occasion will never more present itself." So this really gives us a sense of how important the Montalto Peretti collection remained, even after over a century of dispersal. From Rome, Jenkins sold works all across Europe. This is well documented through his correspondence, in particularly with the English collector Charles Townley, who bought several pieces from the Montalto Villa from Jenkins, and they are now in the British Museum, such as this caryatid on the screen. So perhaps the Apollo was with Jenkins and was among the sculptures sold to English collectors that Moritz saw in Rome with Jenkins when he visited and took back to Rugby Hall. But we have no documentary evidence for this hypothesis, but it seems a very plausible itinerary for the sculpture. But we haven't yet looked closely at it. And once again, we can see the restorations. A closer examination reveals clear lines of breakage in the stone, and it also shows that the sculpture is composed of two different marbles. I think that you can see it on the photo on the right. The head, the upper torso, and the right leg are in a white marble with darker veining, while the hips, the left leg, and the tree trunk are in an ivory marble with orange staining. This distinction helps us separate the ancient Roman fragments, which had been buried for centuries, from the later addition made by a restorer. So here are some drawings highlighting the ancient Roman fragment, whereas the early modern restorations are in blue. We can say that the sculpture was restored before the 1630s because it appears in a complete state on the drawing of the Codex Montalto. But can we find out when this restoration occurred and which artists worked on the sculpture? The art historian Anna Siedel has compared the two Apollos from Villa Montalto to two other seated Apollo playing the lyre that were known in another Roman collection at the same time, in the Ludovisi collection. And the Ludovisi marble restoration is well documented. They were made by the Baroque Italian sculptor Ippolito Buzzi. Because of the similarities in pose, Siedel suggested that Buzzi may have also made the restorations of the Montalto works. But her attribution, however, was based only on the drawings from the Codex and not on the real sculpture. And when we compare the facial features of the DMA's Apollo with the photographs of the Apollos in the Ludovisi collection, the resemblance is not entirely convincing. An alternative theory was raised by comparing the head of our Apollo with restorations carried out in Venice in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, especially the restorations of the marbles of the Grimani collection, which are attributed to the workshop of Tullio Lombardo. Apollo's, if we look closer Apollo's facial traits do indeed seem closer to Lombardo's circle than to the previous Roman Baroque style. If this Venetian attribution proves correct, it suggests that the Roman fragment of the sculpture was discovered much earlier, as early as the late 15th century, and restored not in Rome, but in Venice maybe, before eventually entering the Montalto collection. This hypothesis remains open and calls for further research. For now, the sculpture is not yet on display. It requires conservation before it can be safely presented to the public. But this conservation work and the collaboration with specialists of Venetian 16th century sculpture is sure to open up new discoveries regarding the DMA's Apollo and to possibly confirm this attribution. The Heracles sculpture bust is on display, and I encourage you to go see him in the European art galleries on level 2. I hope that when looking at him, you will remember the stories of the collectors and artists who shaped his appearance over the centuries. Thank you. And now if you have some questions.
Thank you very much. My question is, why do you see so many Roman and Greek statues without limbs or heads or other parts of their body?
This is due to the archaeological context of building collapsing, so sculptures fall, break, and also the way they were digged. And like I said, the restorers wanted to preserve a Roman fragment, but then restore it in a complete figure. So they were not necessarily interested in taking all the small broken fragments, but just keeping the main fragment to restore.
And my second question is there any pressure at DMA from the country of origin of these statues and art to return these pieces of work?
No, these are historical collections, so there is no pressure of any kind for this type of work with a very ancient history. Very well documented. Yeah.
With respect to the bust of Heracles in our collection, do we know whether restoration was actually completed by Adam? And is the condition that we see it in today a deterioration from what he created, or was it never finished and this is it?
So I will go back to a photo of the bust. So it is true that the surface of the bust is damaged, and this might be due to being outside, maybe in the 19th century, after it left, because we don't really know the history of this bust after it was sold after Adam's death. And it is likely that it was outside, given the condition of the stone. And we can also see that Adam had restored parts of the folds of the drapery on the bust, and some of the restored drapery are now broken. So we are missing fragments there. Trying to find the image. Yeah.
So do they know what quarry this came from?
No, we haven't. I mean, if we trust Lambert Sigisbert Adam, he says marble of Paros, but we haven't tasted the marble to know which quarry it comes from.
Because when I went to Paris, I found by going through a kitchen tour and down into the cellar, they went 4 floors below the kitchen at the Jour 5, and in the Le 5 restaurant kitchen. Then you went four floors below, and they said that the Arc de Triomphe, the quarry was under that building. So it was it was a really nice refrigerated space because of how far below. But if I didn't take the tour, I wouldn't have known where that came from. So I was thinking, like, wonder if they know what quarry or what area that's from. I know Rome, but were there quarries around there that?
Yeah, it's likely that for restoration of ancient marbles, Adam and like French restorers might import marble from Italy specifically for this work.
Okay, thank you.
First of all, Villain, wonderful job. I mean, it's amazing to see how much research you've done. So we're very proud of your work. So I just want clarification. This sculpture here, both the head and the torso are ancient, but from different sculptures, right?
Yes, that's it.
Why? I'm just curious. What has led to the dating of the head to the 1st century CE?
It was by comparison.
Okay.
But I'm open to any other suggestions.
Oh, no, I mean, it could certainly be Flavian, I would say, but it could also, there's parts of it to me that look more Antonine. So I wonder if it could be a little later, but I was just curious if there was a specific.
Yeah, it was
just a visual.
Yeah, and publications of it mentioned 1st century, and yeah.
Okay, well, that's sort of, well, thank you again. It's wonderful.
Thank you very much.